The snow had no mercy that night. It fell in thick, heavy curtains over the village of Ashenvale, blanketing the cobblestones in white silence, swallowing the warmth of every hearth behind every closed door. Lottie stood at the edge of the pack's main gate, outside it to be precise, with nothing but a wool cloak that had seen too many winters, and a single leather satchel pressed against her chest like it was the last thing in the world she owned. It was. Her breath came out in pale clouds. She didn't move, not because she was frozen, though the cold had long since stolen the feeling from her fingers, but because she genuinely did not know where to go. The gate behind her was shut, locked. The heavy iron bar had been dropped into place by hands she once thought would hold hers for a lifetime. Garrett's hands. She closed her eyes and heard his voice again, low and certain, the way he always spoke when he'd already made up his mind. "You're not what I need, Lottie. You never were. The pack requires heirs. You can't give me that. You can't give anyone that." He hadn't screamed. He hadn't even looked sorry. He'd simply handed her the satchel, her own belongings, already packed, which told her he'd planned this long before he said a word, and opened the gate just wide enough for her to walk through. Then he closed it. She was 23 years old, rejected by her mate, cast out of the only pack she'd ever known, standing in the snow with nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat since morning. The cold crept up through the soles of her boots, thin leather worn nearly through at the heel. She pulled the cloak tighter, but it did little good. The wind found every gap, every loose thread, every place the fabric had thinned with age. She began to walk, not because she had a direction, but because standing still felt too much like giving up. The road that wound away from Ashenvale's gate stretched north through a corridor of black pine trees. Snow muffled everything. There were no torches out here, no lanterns. Just the pale glow of a cloud-smothered moon and the sound of her own boots crunching through the crust of ice over older snow. She walked for what felt like an hour before her legs began to tremble. She found a fallen log at the road's edge, half buried in a drift, and sat down. Just for a moment, she told herself, just to catch her breath. She pressed her back against a pine trunk and pulled her knees to her chest, tucking her cloak around her feet, and tried to remember everything she'd been told about surviving in the cold. Keep moving. Find shelter. Don't let yourself sleep. But she was so tired, not just from walking, tired in the way that went all the way to the bone. The kind of tired that came from years of trying to be enough, years of herbal remedies pressed into her hands by the pack healer. Each one a quiet reminder of what she lacked. Years of watching Garrett's expression shift from love to something colder and more clinical, measuring her against a future she couldn't give him. She pressed her fingers to her sternum, where the mate bond had been. That warm, golden thread she'd felt since she was 17. It was gone now. Severed. The rejection had left something raw in its place, a hollow ache, like a tooth pulled from the root. She didn't hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. The sound came from the north, from deeper in the trees, which made no sense, because there was nothing north of Ashenvale except the border territories, and beyond that, the sovereign lands of the High Pack. Nobody traveled from there at this hour. Nobody without reason. She scrambled to her feet, pressing herself back against the pine. Through the darkness and the falling snow, she saw the shapes emerge, a column of riders in dark wool and leather, moving in perfect, unhurried silence. No torches. They didn't need them. Their eyes caught the moonlight the way hers couldn't, gold and amber and pale silver, cutting through the dark like lantern flames. Wolves. High-born wolves by the look of the crests on their cloaks. She counted 8 riders before she stopped counting, because the 9th made her breath catch. He rode at the column's center, on a horse so black it was nearly invisible against the tree line, and he was large in the way that certain men were large. Not merely tall, but present, as though the air around him bent slightly toward him, unable to help itself. His cloak was charcoal and fur-lined, his jaw set against the cold with the indifference of someone who had never once been defeated by weather. Even at a distance, something about the way he sat his horse, perfectly still, perfectly certain, told her that this man had never in his life wondered if he was enough. The column slowed. She realized, a half-second too late, that she was standing directly in the road. She stepped aside quickly, pressing into the tree line, eyes down. Wolves of that rank didn't acknowledge strays on the road. They passed through like weather, inevitable, indifferent. She just needed them to keep riding. They stopped. Not all of them, just the one in the center. His black horse halted directly beside her position, breath steaming in the cold air, hooves shifting once against the snow. She felt the weight of his gaze before she looked up, and when she did, she found him already watching her. His eyes were the color of deep amber, almost copper in the low light. They moved across her face, then down to the leather satchel clutched in her arms, then back up. His expression did not change. It was not unkind. It was simply the face of a man who saw things clearly and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. "You're from Ashenvale." It wasn't a question. His voice was low, unhurried, and it carried easily over the wind without effort. She didn't answer immediately. Her throat had tightened in a way she couldn't entirely explain. "Yes," she finally said. "You're outside the gate." "Yes." His gaze dropped to her boots, and she became acutely aware of the snow soaking through the cracked leather at her heel. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, precisely. Something older and less comfortable than pity. "How long have you been out here?" "Not long," she said, which was a lie, and she suspected he knew it. One of the riders behind him, a woman with close-cropped silver hair and sharp cheekbones, leaned forward slightly in her saddle. "My lord, we're behind schedule." He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Lottie, steady and unreadable. "Give me your name," he said. She hesitated. Names were power. Names were how packs tracked strays, returned them, or worse, reported them. But she was standing in the snow with no home and no bond and no future she could see clearly, and lying to a man with eyes like that seemed like an extraordinarily poor decision. "Lottie," she said, "just Lottie." He was quiet for a moment. The snow fell between them. Then he reached down, a single unhurried motion, and extended his gloved hand toward her. "Come," he said. She stared at his hand, then at his face, then at the column of riders behind him, none of whom looked particularly welcoming. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you're standing in the snow with a hole in your boot, and whatever's in that satchel is all you have left." A pause. "And I have 9 children at home with no one capable of keeping them in line." She blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. "9," she repeated. 9. There was something in his voice that she couldn't name. It wasn't amusement, quite. It was something more tired than that, more honest. "Come with me." The wind pushed hard through the pines, scattering snow across the road. Lottie looked at his hand, still extended, patient and still. She looked at the locked gate behind her. She looked at the long, dark, frozen road ahead. She reached up and took his hand. The estate appeared through the trees like something that had always existed. Not built, but grown, the way mountains grow, slowly and without apology. Lottie saw it first as shadow against a sky that had begun to lighten at its edges, the deep blue-black of early morning pressing thin along the horizon. Then the shadow resolved into stone. Dark granite walls rising 3 stories, towers at the corners, windows glowing amber from within like eyes half open in sleep. Torches burned at the iron gates, and the smell of burning pine pitch drifted through the cold air, mixing with wood smoke and something warmer beneath it. Bread, she thought. Someone inside was already awake and baking. Her stomach answered before she could tell it not to. She was seated on the black horse behind one of the quieter riders, a broad-shouldered young man who had said nothing to her except a single, courteous hold here before pulling her up behind him. The man she now knew, from fragments of conversation she'd caught between the riders, was called Lord Caius, had ridden ahead without looking back, as though he'd already made his decision and had no further use for second-guessing. She found that both irritating and, against her will, slightly reassuring. The gates opened without ceremony. The column rode into a wide courtyard, where stable hands appeared from the dark, boys mostly, moving with the quiet efficiency of people long accustomed to late arrivals. Lottie was helped down from the horse by the same broad-shouldered rider, who gave her a short, careful look before turning away. Caius had already dismounted. He stood at the entrance to the main hall, double doors of heavy oak, iron-banded, speaking in low tones to a woman in a dark dress who held a lantern in one hand and a thick ring of keys in the other. The woman was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair wound tightly at her neck, and an expression that suggested she had been managing chaos for decades and had made a personal peace with it. Caius said something. The woman's eyes moved to Lottie. She crossed the courtyard toward them, snow crunching under her boots, one foot noticeably colder than the other, and stopped a few paces away. Up close, in the torchlight, Caius was even more distinctly himself. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, long-heeled to silver. His hair was dark, slightly overlong, pushed back from his face by the wind of the ride. He was looking at her again with that same direct, assessing gaze that seemed entirely uninterested in performing anything for her benefit. "This is Maren," he said, indicating the woman with the keys. "She runs the house. Whatever you need tonight, she'll provide." He paused. "Tomorrow we'll discuss the arrangement." "The arrangement," Lottie repeated. "You'll meet the children in the morning." He said it the way someone might say you'll meet the weather in the morning, as a simple fact of life, inevitable, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply real. "Get some sleep." Then he walked inside, and the doors closed behind him. Lottie stood in the courtyard with snow in her hair, and a hole in her boot, and absolutely no understanding of what had just happened to her life. Maren appeared at her elbow. "Come," the older woman said, not unkindly, "before you freeze solid and become a problem for someone to move." The room Maren gave her was on the second floor. Small, but warmer than anything Lottie had felt against her skin in hours. A narrow bed with wool blankets, a low fire already built in the hearth, a pitcher of water and a basin on the wooden table by the wall. The floor was stone but covered with a rug, thick and faded, in shades of rust and brown. On the chair beside the bed, Maren placed a folded nightgown, plain linen, large enough to be comfortable, without comment. "Boots off," Maren said, already moving toward the fire to check it. Lottie sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her right boot, then her left. A small amount of melted snow ran out onto the stone floor. Maren looked at the boots, then at Lottie, then said nothing. She simply took both boots and set them near the fire. "The children wake at dawn," she said, still not turning around. "All 9. Sometimes earlier, which is a particular kind of hell that I will leave for you to discover yourself." She adjusted a log in the hearth. "They are not cruel children. They are simply numerous." "How old are they?" Lottie asked. Maren finally turned. She seemed to be deciding something. "The eldest is 12. The youngest is 3. A pause. "Twins at 7. Twins again at 5. The rest are spread between." Lottie stared at her. "Lord Caius did not father all of them himself," Maren said, reading her expression with the ease of long practice. "Some were taken in, orphaned by border conflicts, abandoned, brought to him through various circumstances over the years." She moved to the door. "He keeps them, all of them. That is what he does." She paused at the threshold. "He told me you were turned out," she said, not cruelly. "Rejected." Lottie said nothing. Her jaw was tight. "Half the children in that house were turned out by someone too," Maren said. "You'll fit in well enough." She pulled the door most of the way closed. "Sleep. You'll need it." She didn't sleep immediately. She lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, where the firelight threw moving shapes against the stone, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day. The moment Garrett had handed her the satchel. The cold of the road. The enormous black horse and the amber-eyed man who had extended his hand without explanation. "I have 9 children at home, with no one capable of keeping them in line." She pressed her fingers against the hollow place where the mate bond had been. Still raw. Still aching. But underneath the ache was something else now. A thin, fragile thread of something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Curiosity. She was asleep before she finished examining it. She was woken before dawn by a sound she could not immediately identify. It resolved, after a moment of confused blinking, into a child standing in the half-open doorway of her room, holding a candle in both hands, and staring at her with the fixed, unblinking intensity that only very small children and very old wolves could sustain without discomfort. The child was perhaps 3 years old, dark-haired, round-faced, wearing a nightgown several sizes too large, bare feet on the cold stone floor. She said nothing. She simply stared. Lottie sat up. "Hello," she said carefully. The child held out the candle, as if offering it, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to do at this hour. "That's," Lottie started. "That's yours. You should keep it." The child continued to extend the candle. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of a door opening, and then a man's voice, low, tired, familiar, saying a name she couldn't quite catch. Then footsteps, unhurried but purposeful, moving down the corridor. Caius appeared in the doorway behind the child. He was in a simpler version of himself. No cloak, no riding leather, just a dark linen shirt untucked at the collar, and the look of a man who had also not slept enough. He looked at the child, then at Lottie, then at the candle still being offered with absolute solemnity. He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "She does this. Brings things to people she's decided to trust." His voice was different here, inside the house, away from the column of riders and the frozen road, lower, less armored. Lottie looked at the small face watching her. Slowly, she reached out and accepted the candle. The child smiled, sudden and enormous, and completely unguarded, and turned and ran back down the corridor in her too large nightgown, bare feet slapping against stone. In the doorway, Caius watched this. Something moved across his face that he didn't seem entirely aware of. Something that looked like relief, almost. Worn very close to the surface. He looked at Lottie. "Dawn," he said. "We'll talk then." He pulled the door gently closed. Lottie sat in the dark with a candle in her hands, and the warmth of a child's trust still strange and new against her skin. And she thought that she had absolutely no idea what she had walked into. She thought, too, that she was not entirely sorry she had. Dawn came the way it always did in stone houses, slowly, gray light pressing through thick shuttered windows before the sun had properly committed to rising. Lottie heard the house wake before she saw it. First the youngest ones, a shuffle of small feet, and the muffled thud of something falling off a surface it shouldn't have been on. Then voices, two of them arguing in the particular high-pitched register of children who are both absolutely certain they are right. Then a door slamming. Then silence. Then the door slamming again. She dressed quickly in her own clothes. She had 3 changes in the satchel, all of them plain, all of them clean, and braided her dark hair back from her face. The boots Maren had set by the fire were dry now, the cracked leather softened slightly by the heat. She laced them carefully and stood and looked at the room in full daylight for the first time. Small. Practical. A window that faced east, currently showing a sky the color of ash, pressing toward pale gold. The fire had burned to coals. Somewhere below, she could smell the bread from last night more strongly now, and meat fat, and something herbal, rosemary perhaps, and the mineral sharpness of cold well water carried in a bucket. She went downstairs. The kitchen was a large room at the back of the house, low-ceilinged and warm, with a hearth big enough to stand inside, and a long oak table already crowded with the particular chaos of a household that had never quite achieved order, and had stopped apologizing for it. 3 children were seated at the table eating porridge. A 4th was standing on a stool at the hearth counter, apparently attempting to reach something on a high shelf, while a 5th child, slightly older, perhaps 10, stood below with arms outstretched in the universal posture of someone who both wants to help and knows this is going to end badly. Maren moved through all of it like a woman navigating a river she had learned long ago not to fight. Efficiently, without panic, redistributing bowls and redirecting small bodies with the minimum force necessary. She looked up when Lottie appeared in the doorway. "Sit," she said. "There's porridge." Lottie sat at the end of the table that had the most available space, which was not much. The child to her immediate left, the boy who had been standing on the stool, was now seated, apparently having been redirected by Maren through means Lottie hadn't seen, turned and looked at her with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "You're new," he said. He was perhaps 7, with a wide face and a gap where a front tooth had recently been. "I am," Lottie said. "What's your name?" "Lottie." He considered this. "I'm Pip. That's my twin sister Wren." He pointed at a girl across the table with the same wide face and the same gap-toothed smile, who waved without looking up from her porridge. "The big one is Theo." The 10-year-old, who had now taken the seat at Maren's end of the table, gave Lottie a brief, measured look that reminded her uncomfortably of his father. "The babies are Soren and Blythe." 2 small faces at the other end of the table, neither of them babies exactly, but both young enough to be wearing their porridge as much as eating it. "And Rue already likes you," Pip added, as though this settled something important. Rue. The child from the doorway last night, Lottie assumed. She wasn't at the table yet. "Where are the others?" Lottie asked. Felix and Dara are still asleep because they were up late and Father doesn't make them come down when they're tired, Pip said, with the precise informational delivery of a child who has been asked this question and has the answer fully prepared. And Sable's outside because she's always outside. How old is Sable? 12, said Theo, from his end of the table, without looking up. His voice was careful, guarded. She won't come in for breakfast. She doesn't eat with people she doesn't know. The way he said people she doesn't know had an extra layer to it. A warning, perhaps, or a test. Lottie filed it away and said nothing. Maren set a bowl of porridge in front of her, hot, thick, with a spoonful of dark honey already dissolving into it. Lottie wrapped both hands around the bowl and let the warmth move through her palms and up her arms, and for a moment, she simply sat in the loud, warm, complicated morning and breathed. Caius found her after breakfast, standing in the courtyard with her cloak on, watching the tree line. The sky had brightened to a pale winter blue, thin clouds pulling apart at the edges. The snow was deep, but the wind had calmed, and in the stillness, she could hear birds somewhere in the pines. Small, quick sounds, life insisting on itself despite the cold. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that she was aware of his presence the way you were aware of a fire in a room, by its warmth and its particular quality of attention. You met some of them, he said. Pip gave me a full briefing, she said. Very thorough. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, and then thought better of itself. He does that. A silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. You said we'd talk, she said. About the arrangement. Yes. He looked at the tree line. His jaw was set in the way she was beginning to recognize. Not coldness, but deliberateness. A man who chose his words the way other men chose weapons. I need someone to manage the household. Not as a servant. Maren handles the practical work and she's not going anywhere. What I need is someone to be present with them. To be a consistent adult voice that isn't mine or Maren's. He paused. Someone who can give them something I don't have time to give them every hour of every day. What's that? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Softness, he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. I'm not. I provide for them. I protect them. I am here. He stopped. But I am not always soft with them. I don't know how to be consistently. I was not taught that. Lottie looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the tree line with the expression of a man making a confession he had rehearsed alone and was now delivering with less comfort than he'd hoped. In exchange, he continued, voice returning to its more business-like register, you have a room, food, safety, and the protection of this house and my name while you're under this roof. No one from Ashenvale or anywhere else can touch you here. The last sentence landed differently than the rest. She thought of Garrett, of the iron bar dropping into place across the gate. And what happens when you find someone? She asked, keeping her voice even. A real mate. Someone who can give you what a pack lord needs. He finally turned to look at her, those amber eyes, direct and undecorated. I had a mate, he said. She died 4 years ago. Fever in the winter. 3 of the 9 children are hers. He let that settle. I am not looking for another. She held his gaze. Why me, specifically? You found me on a road. You were alone in the snow with a satchel and a bad boot, he said. And when Rue brought you a candle in the dark, you took it. He turned back to the tree line. That's enough for me to start with. Lottie stood in the cold morning air and looked at the house, the stone walls, the amber windows, the smoke rising from 3 separate chimneys into the winter sky. From somewhere on the far side of the building, she heard a child's voice, high and clear, calling something to someone invisible in the trees. Sable, she thought. The one who didn't eat with strangers. She thought about softness, about what it cost a man like Caius to say that word out loud. She thought about the hollow place in her chest where the bond had been, and how this morning, sitting at that crowded table with porridge going cold in a bowl, and a gap-toothed boy explaining the household to her like she already belonged in it, the hollow place had hurt a little less. All right, she said. I'll stay. He nodded once. Not with relief, or not only relief, with something quieter than that, something that looked, from a certain angle, like gratitude. He went back inside. Lottie stayed in the cold a moment longer, watching the tree line, where the shape of a girl, 12 years old, dark-cloaked, standing very still among the pines, was watching her back. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She simply held the girl's gaze across the snow, steady and patient, until Sable turned and disappeared into the trees. It was a beginning. 3 weeks passed before Lottie stopped flinching at the noise, not because the house got quieter. It didn't, not once. Not even on the mornings when half the children were still asleep, and the other half were theoretically occupied with lessons. It was simply that her body adjusted, the way bodies eventually adjusted to cold rivers and difficult terrain, learning to move through the constant current of sound and motion without bracing against it every moment. She learned their rhythms. Pip and Wren woke at identical times, and were immediately in conflict about something trivial, whose turn it was to carry water, whose boot was on the wrong side of the door. But the conflict burned out just as fast, replaced by absolute solidarity against the rest of the world. Theo, the eldest boy, was quiet and watchful and helped Marin without being asked, which Lottie recognized as the behavior of a child who had learned early that making himself useful was the safest way to belong somewhere. The younger twins, Soren and Blythe, were at the age where everything was either hilarious or catastrophic with no middle ground, and their assessment of which was which changed without warning. Felix and Dara, both 9, had arrived together from a village 3 days' ride east, orphaned by a border raid 2 years prior. They were close in the particular sealed-off way of children who had survived something and decided that the two of them were enough. They were polite to Lottie. They were polite to everyone. Politeness, she understood, was their armor. And then there was Rue. Rue was everywhere. Rue appeared at Lottie's elbow during breakfast and pressed her small, warm weight against Lottie's side without explanation. Rue brought her things: a smooth stone, a dried flower, a wooden spoon that appeared to have no narrative attached to it, with the solemn, ceremonial quality of a child performing important diplomatic work. Rue had not yet strung more than 4 words together in Lottie's presence, but communicated with extraordinary efficiency through proximity and offering. Caius watched all of this without comment. He was present at meals when he could be, which was perhaps every other day. He rode out frequently, to the border territories, to meetings with pack elders from surrounding lands, to places Marin mentioned in passing with the careful neutrality of someone who knew more than she said. When he was home, he was entirely home, sitting at the head of the long table, asking specific questions of each child in turn, listening to the answers with the focused attention of a man who considered this the most important meeting of his day. He was not warm exactly, not in the easy instinctive way that Lottie was slowly learning to be, but he was present, and that, she was coming to understand, was its own kind of love. He did not speak to her much those first weeks, not coldly, simply, carefully, as though he was watching to see who she was before deciding how to talk to her. She did the same with him. It was Sable who broke the careful distance first, though not in the way Lottie expected. She found the girl on the roof, not the main roof, a lower section at the back of the house, accessible through a window at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor, where the stone was flat and wide and dusted with snow. Lottie had gone looking for a missing wool blanket that Marin wanted tracked down, following a trail of small clues through the house the way you followed animal tracks through a forest, and the trail had ended at that window. Sable was sitting with her back against the chimney stack, knees drawn up, a book open across her legs. She didn't look up when Lottie climbed through the window. "There's a blanket here somewhere," Lottie said, looking around. There was, folded neatly under one of Sable's feet, serving as insulation between her and the cold stone. "It's mine," Sable said, still not looking up. "Marin wants it back. Marin wants a lot of things." Lottie looked at the sky, pale and vast above the tree line, a hawk turning slow circles somewhere high up, and then sat down on the stone, a few feet from the girl, not close, not crowding. She said nothing. Sable turned a page. After a while, "You're not going to make me come down?" "No," Lottie said. Another page. "Why not?" "Because you're not in danger up here and you're reading, which seems like a reasonable use of time." Lottie pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. "And because no one ever came and sat with me when I wanted to be alone, and I spent a long time thinking that meant something was wrong with me. It didn't. I just needed someone to be nearby without making demands." A long silence. Sable finally looked up, her face, up close and in full daylight, was sharp-featured and serious, dark eyes that took information in without immediately giving anything back. She looked, Lottie thought, extraordinarily like her father. "My mother died up here," Sable said. Flat, like a fact, like she had stated it so many times in her own mind that the words had worn smooth. "Not on the roof, in the house, but I can see the window of her room from here." She looked across the roof line. "I come up here when I need to think about her without anyone watching me do it." Lottie said nothing. She didn't fill the silence with comfort. She just let it be. "She was kind," Sable said. "Not soft. Kind. There's a difference." She looked at Lottie sidelong. "Father is trying to find someone kind. For the little ones. He thinks I don't know that's what he's doing." "Do you mind?" Lottie asked quietly. Sable considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I mind people who pretend," she said finally, "who come in and try to be something they're not because they think that's what we need." She held Lottie's gaze. "You haven't pretended anything since you got here." It was not warmth exactly, but from Sable, Lottie understood. It was as close as trust got. That evening, after the younger children were in bed and the house had descended into its particular exhausted nighttime stillness, Lottie sat by the kitchen fire and let the tiredness move through her properly for the first time. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were chapped from cold water and winter air. Somewhere in the wall, a timber contracted against the frost, a low groan of old wood settling. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his boots on stone, unhurried and deliberate. Caius came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. Then he continued to the fire and sat in the chair on the opposite side of the hearth, stretching his long legs toward the warmth. He poured 2 cups of something from the pot Marin had left warming at the fire's edge, dark, spiced, smelling of clove and dried apple, and set one on the stones beside her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up. They sat in silence for a while, which had stopped being uncomfortable sometime in the past week, without either of them acknowledging it. "Sable talked to you," he said finally. "Not a question." "She told me about your wife," Lottie said carefully. "Not much. Just that she was kind." Something crossed his face. Old grief. Familiar with the path it traveled. "She was," he said. "Bryn. She was..." He stopped, set his cup down. "She was the reason this house was a home instead of just a building I happened to live in." He looked at the fire. "When she died, I didn't know how to keep it being that without her. So you started bringing children home," Lottie said. Not accusingly, simply. "I stopped being able to turn them away," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and they both knew it. Every one of them was someone's Bryn. Someone they'd lost. He was quiet. "I couldn't fix that. But I could give them a room and a fire and a table to sit at." Lottie thought of the hollow place in her chest. Thought of Garrett's voice, flat and certain. "You can't give me that. You can't give anyone that. I can't have children," she said quietly. She hadn't planned to say it, but it sat in the space between them, and it seemed dishonest to leave it unspoken. "That's why I was turned out." Caius looked at her. His amber eyes moved over her face with that same direct, undecorated attention. "I know," he said. She blinked. "How?" "Marin knows the healer at Ashenvale. She made inquiries before I spoke to you in the morning." He held her gaze steadily. "I didn't ask her to. She does it because she protects this house and the people in it." A pause. "It made no difference to my offer." The fire cracked. A log shifted, sending a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. "Why not?" she asked. He picked up his cup again, looked into it for a moment before answering. "Because I have 9 children," he said simply. "And none of them came from where people thought children had to come from." He looked at her. "The ones who need you don't need you to have made them. They just need you to stay." Lottie sat with that for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the stone walls, looking for gaps. It didn't find any. The house held against it, solid and patient, the way it had held against every winter it had ever faced. She looked at the man across the fire from her, at the old scar along his jaw and the tired, honest set of his eyes, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not where the bond had been, but somewhere adjacent to it. Something quieter. Something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. She didn't name it yet, but she didn't look away from it either. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a writer Lottie didn't recognize. A young man in the colors of a pack she knew too well. gray and dark green, the sigil of a running wolf stitched at the breast. He handed the sealed envelope to Marin at the door without dismounting, turned his horse, and left, before Lottie had fully registered what she was seeing through the kitchen window. She knew those colors in her bones. Marin brought the letter to Caius's study. Lottie heard nothing for an hour. Then Caius appeared in the corridor outside the kitchen, and the quality of his silence was different from his usual silence, tighter, held in place by conscious effort, rather than natural calm. He looked at her for a moment. "Come to the study," he said. The study was a room she hadn't spent much time in. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of bound ledgers and rolled maps, a desk of dark wood scarred by decades of use, 2 chairs facing the hearth. It smelled of ink and leather and the particular dry warmth of a room where a fire burned consistently. He sat behind the desk. She took one of the hearth chairs without being asked, which 6 weeks ago she wouldn't have done. He set the letter on the desk between them. The seal was broken. She could read the opening line from where she sat. On behalf of Alpha Garrett of Ashenvale Pack, this correspondence is directed to Lord Caius regarding the unauthorized harboring of a rejected and unclaimed female. She stopped reading. "He's claiming you were taken unlawfully," Caius said. His voice was even. "That as a rejected wolf without independent pack standing, you fall under Ashenvale's continued legal authority until formally released by him." He paused. "He's requesting your return." The word return sat in the room like something with weight. Lottie's hands were flat on her knees. She could feel her own heartbeat. Too fast, too loud, embarrassing in its transparency. She made herself breathe evenly before she spoke. "He threw me out in the snow," she said. "Yes." Caius folded his hands on the desk. Legally, that's a complicated position for him. But he has pack elders willing to support his claim, and certain elder councils still interpret the old codes in ways that favor the rejecting alpha over the rejected wolf. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's unjust. It is also, in some jurisdictions, technically arguable." She looked at him. "What happens if you refuse?" He escalates to the High Elder Council. There is a formal hearing. It takes months, creates political tension, potentially draws other packs into a dispute over territorial authority. He met her gaze. "I've dealt with worse, but it causes problems for you," she said. "Most things worth doing cause problems," he said. There was no drama in it. It was simply a fact he'd arrived at through long experience. She looked at the letter, at Garrett's name at the bottom, written in the sharp, certain hand of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. "There is a simpler legal resolution," Caius said, and something in his tone shifted. Carefully, precisely, like a man picking his words off a high shelf where fragile things were stored. "If you hold formal standing within this pack, Ashenvale's claim dissolves entirely. Pack members cannot be recalled by external alphas." Lottie was quiet for a moment. "How does someone gain formal standing in your pack?" He held her gaze. "There are 2 ways. Formal adoption into the pack lineage, which requires elder council approval and takes several months, or..." He stopped. "Or recognized partnership with the alpha." The fire breathed between them. "I'm not asking that of you," he said immediately, clearly. "I want that understood. I am presenting you with the legal landscape, not making a demand. Whatever you decide, I will manage the consequences through other means." His eyes were steady and entirely without pressure. "But I thought you deserved to know all the options." Lottie looked at the letter again. She thought about what return meant. Ashenvale's gate closing behind her, Garrett's flat, certain voice, a pack that had known her since childhood deciding she was worth less than her biology. She thought about a gap-toothed boy explaining the household to her on her first morning, a small girl offering a candle in the dark, a 12-year-old sitting on a cold roof, willing to be seen. She thought about a man who collected broken things and gave them rooms and fires and tables and asked for nothing except that they stay. "Is there a third option?" she asked. "Something that isn't months of hearings and isn't partnership?" "Formal employment designation," he said. "Pack-employed caretaker with alpha-granted residency status. It's a real legal category, less common now than it once was. It wouldn't fully dissolve the claim, but it would significantly complicate Garrett's argument and buy time." He paused. "It is the weakest of the 3 options. But it's the most honest one," she said. He tilted his head slightly. How do you mean? She chose her words carefully. The other two options would protect me by making me something I'm not yet. An established pack member. A partner. She looked at him. I've been here 6 weeks. I don't want to trade one situation where I'm defined by what I can give someone for another one. A pause. I want to earn where I stand, not be granted it out of necessity. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The expression of a person hearing something said out loud that they have thought privately for a long time. The employment designation, then, he said. For now. For now, she agreed. He drafted the formal response to Garrett's letter himself that afternoon, in language that was precise and entirely without venom, which Lottie suspected was more devastating than anger would have been. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know for another 2 weeks, was that the letter from Ashenvale was not Garrett's idea. Marin told her, in the particular way Marin told things she decided you needed to know, sideways, in the middle of another task, without looking at you directly. They were sorting dried herbs in the kitchen, bundles of sage and thyme, and something bitter that Lottie didn't know the name of, tying them with strips of linen and hanging them from the low ceiling beams to finish drying. Outside, snow had begun again, soft and persistent. The writer who brought that letter, Marin said, tying off a bundle of sage. He wasn't from Ashenvale's regular dispatch. Lottie stilled. What do you mean? His horse. I know the breeding lines in this region. That animal came from Vordwell stock. She hung the bundle on its hook. Vordwell is 3 territories east. Lottie thought about this. Someone put Garrett up to it. Someone told Garrett he had a legal argument worth making, Marin said carefully, and provided him the specific language to use. That letter used phrasing from Elder Council statutes that a village alpha wouldn't know off the top of his head. She reached for another bundle. Someone with knowledge of pack law and motivation to create difficulty for this house. Who would want to create difficulty for Caius? Lottie asked. Marin was quiet for a moment. Lord Caius controls more territory than any single pack lord in 4 generations, she said finally. He has 9 children, which means 9 potential futures, 9 potential alliances. He has no formal mate, which means no consolidated political loyalty to any single bloodline. She paused. There are those who would prefer he remain isolated, manageable. She looked at Lottie for the first time. And there are those who would very much prefer that no one new came into this house and gave it something it was missing. The sage smell was sharp and clean in the cold air. Who? Lottie asked. Marin turned back to the herbs. That, she said, is what I'm working on finding out. That night, Lottie lay in her room, which had stopped feeling like a borrowed room sometime in the past month, and had begun feeling, quietly and without announcement, like hers, and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Garrett's letter, about Vordwell horses and Elder Council language, about someone, somewhere, who had looked at this house full of mended broken things and decided it was a threat worth dismantling. She thought about 9 children sleeping in rooms above and below her, none of whom had asked to need protecting, and all of whom needed it anyway. She thought about Caius saying for now, in a voice that was careful and honest, and left the future genuinely open. She pressed her fingers to her chest. The hollow place was still there. It would always be there, she suspected, the shape of something lost. But around it, slowly and without drama, something else had been building, warm and complicated and entirely unplanned. She was still lying there thinking when she heard it. A sound from the corridor outside her door, not a child this time. Adult footsteps, stopping just outside. A pause. Then, quietly, Caius's voice through the door. Lottie. She sat up. Yes, a brief silence. The eldest children, Felix and Dara. They heard things today. From the other riders, words they shouldn't have caught. They're asking questions I don't know how to answer tonight. Another pause, and in it she heard something unfamiliar in his voice. Not weakness, but the closest thing to uncertainty she'd heard from him. Would you come? She was out of bed and at the door before he finished speaking. She opened it and found him standing in the corridor in lamplight, and for just a moment, before he composed his expression into its usual careful steadiness, she saw exactly how tired he was, how much he was holding, how long he had been holding it alone. Yes, she said simply. Show me where they are. He looked at her for a moment, that direct, undecorated gaze. Then he turned and she followed him down the corridor, toward the sound of two children who needed someone to stay, and she thought that for now was perhaps not so temporary as she'd said. She thought that she was already, without quite having decided to, becoming something more than employed. She thought, and this was the thought she didn't push away for the first time, that she didn't mind.